Hey gang, thanks for joining us for another episode of Chicken Skin Moments with Pastor Dain. These are where I share little cool, interesting factoids from the Bible and life that I thought you might enjoy and give you a little chicken skin. Hey, today is about the wrath of God, not usually a very popular subject. And whenever I think of that word wrath, I always think of my Bible school principal he was Scottish and he would call it the wrath of God. And isn't that true? Like when we think of the word wrath, it's like it sounds so dark and dismal, and it is a form of judgment. But I wonder if what you think about the wrath of God is what like a lot of people think. They kind of have this what I call a cartoon version. And that would be like the cartoon version of God up in heaven with a lightning bolt, right? And he's looking down on earth for anybody who's doing wrong. And if somebody does wrong, they sin, man, he's going to take his lightning bolt and he's going to send wrath down on them, you know? And, you know, some people have their own kind of version of this where like, God, you do wrong and you got cancer. That's why, because God's getting even. He sent you cancer. It's the wrath of God. Well, you'll be glad to know that that's a very unbiblical sense of what the wrath of God really is. And what I want to show you today is a really interesting take on what the wrath of God is from the Bible. And I'm going to take you to Romans chapter 1. Now, let me read this one verse. Verse 18, the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Now that kind of sounds like maybe what we were talking about earlier. The wrath of God is coming against but it's interesting. Coming against the godlessness. Now there's an interesting thing about that, right? Because being without God is being without the very source of goodness and life that created us. And there's a key element of what the wrath of God is just in that one word. It's godlessness, the absence of God, and how it's related to wrath. But we're not there yet. Let me keep reading. So, for example, verse 21, though they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but in their thinking they became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal man and birds and animals and reptiles. Now, this is just simply a way of saying, instead of worshiping the true God who they knew about, they instead went after their own little man-made created gods. Doesn't that begin to sound similar? Like kind of this idea that I think I know better than God, or maybe perhaps I am God. And here is what the end result is. Look at this in verse 24. Therefore, God gave them over in their sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another. Now, in that instance, he just uses the element of sex to give one example. There's going to be plenty more in just a minute. But that's a good example. God therefore gave them over. In other words, well, if you don't want to practice sex the way I have ordained it to be between a loving man and a loving woman, and in the institution of marriage, well, you can go and have sex with anybody and everybody. And let me ask you, just in the society you might be living in, how has that worked out? And is that a good plan or a good program? Or maybe that didn't work out quite so well. Now, what's most important about this little lesson here is this one statement. But if you've been paying attention in the book of Romans, he says it 3 times. So I'm going to read all 3 of them to you right now. Therefore, God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts. Then you skip to verse 25. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. And then eventually he gets to verse 28 and he says, furthermore, since they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, he gave them over. Now, isn't that interesting that the wrath of God doesn't seem to be this like throwing of a lightning bolt? But to give somebody over is to just say, well, there you go. If that's the way you'd like to go ahead. Now, here's what I find really cool about this teaching from the book of Romans. 3 different times, God says, I showed them myself. They rejected me. They wanted to go this way towards sin and all that stuff. And so 3 times he says, so I gave them over. So I give you over. I give you over. And then there's the punchline at the end of chapter 1. Because what would a godless world look like? If you walk away from God, what would you reap? What would the world be like without God? And he gives us a great description of it, the last part of chapter 1. He says this, And just before I read these, I want you to just imagine that you just live in this world. Like everything you know is always everything I'm going to read to you right now. Just see how that goes over with your heart. They have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, depravity. They are full of envy and murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips. They are slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, boastful. They invent ways of doing evil, and they disobey their parents. They are senseless, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, they also approve of those who practice them. Now let me ask you, do you want to live in that world? Doesn't that world sound hideous? Now, if we add all of this all together, do you understand what the big picture of what God is telling us? God created everything good. God is the source of life, the source of joy and love and peace and hope and patience, all the good things of God. If you want to live in a godless life and you decide that, hey, maybe I know better, or I want to create a God that lets me do the things I want to do, and you want to walk away from God, God doesn't need to send a lightning bolt after you. He doesn't need to do that to punish you. All he simply has to do is what he said he'd do 3 times. He handed them over, he handed them over, and he will hand you over. And trust me, there's no joy in that. The source of God is life. Now let me just sort of wrap up with this, because a lot of people have a really warped sense about what the basic gospel is and what it is. And a lot of people think it's this: I'm basically a good person, and because I do good, then God likes me. Now, if I do bad, then I feel guilty because now I think God might punish me by throwing me a lightning bolt or sending cancer my way or some hideous thing like that. And so I feel guilty, and so I run away from God. And of course, the farther I away from God, the less I want to be around God, the more I suffer, and the cycle continues. Now, everything I just said right there, just so you know, none of that is true. That is not how the gospel of God works. Basically, the gospel says this: yes, I am prone to sin. I do sin. But when I bring those sins to God and I ask his forgiveness, of course he accepts me. He loves me, and he cleans me up from that sin, and he sends me out, and he says, now try again, but keep me in the picture. Because here's the thing. When you're right with God and you're right before God, man, God is always right there with you. Isn't that great? God is there with you. Because even when you're living some righteous life, you know, you've gotten rid of most of the sin in your life, lousy things can still happen in your life that are no fault of your own, that aren't because of any sin of your own. But when that happens, if you're right with God, man, he's right there with you to help you and bring you through whatever trial God or that life might actually throw your way. So the wrath of God, it's kind of different than what we think sometimes when we say things like, the wrath of God shall come upon thee. Yeah? No, it's just a matter of God saying, you can come my way or you can go your way, but trust me, my way's better. And it is. And I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and I hope you stick with God's path. Hey gang, thanks for watching. Make sure you hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, tell your friends, write your congressman, whatever you got to do. But thanks for watching the video. You're going to want to check out this next video as well. And other than that, we'll see you next time. God bless.